Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Mike Mason, who is the creative director for Call of Cthulhu, and we talked about the 1920s. It's an exciting era, and it is one of the classic eras in which Call of Cthulhu adventures are set. And Mike wanted to give us some insight into the misconceptions that we might have about the 1920s and talk about all the interesting things that happened during that era. I'll jump across the interview in just a moment, but first, please remember to subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.
I think the 1920s are a really interesting era, is because it's an era where things change quite a lot. It's also an era of extremes, and it's also bookended really kind of interestingly between really dark events in human history, to be frank. Two world wars, the only two world wars we've so far had.
So one of the major regions I know that Call of Cthulhu is set in the 1920s is because the foundation of a lot of the original literature and content was created around that time. I have a bit of a weird question. If the 1920s wasn't when writers like Lovecraft were writing, would it still be the most suitable era for Call of Cthulhu?
I think it would still be a really great era for Call of Cthulhu. I don't, most suitable is very subjective. I mean, modern, Lovecraft and the mythos circle of writers, contemporaries of Lovecraft, who were also adding to the mythos at that time, were writing in the modern day. They weren't writing Gothic horror set in the Victorian age or whatever. They weren't writing science fiction, which kind of came potentially a little later in terms of the pulp fictions. They were writing in the modern day. And so there's always this kind of pull that, with horror writing is, you tend to write about what your experience in the modern day. And so, the most appropriate setting often is now. However, the 20s allows us to look back, and we get almost all of the we get all of the information we can find on that setting, because it's history and there's a lot more written about it. It's a lot easier to kind of get information, rather than necessarily, the modern day is full of contradictions and things we don't yet know how they're going to turn out. So in that sense, an historical period just gives us a deeper tapestry to work from. It's kind of, we can be more informed in a sense. I know it's kind of strange to say that, but it's already done. We can look back and find the information we're looking to get. So I think it provides a very engaging and useful kind of setting for the game.
I know that we can look back and we can find this information, just like you said, but very often when I played Call of Cthulhu, I found that there were occasionally details that I got wrong. I forgot that prohibition was a thing, or I would forget some key details. What are some things that people often get wrong about the 1920s when they're playing Call of Cthulhu?
I mean, I should start by saying never worry about it. As long as you're consistent in your presentation, it doesn't really matter. It's a fictional game. It's not an historical recreation. However, having said that, it says in the 1920s, often people will think that, the speakeasy, the illegal drinking den, was a product of prohibition and, the 1920s, when in fact it's not. I mean, they speakeasies, in terms of places that were outside the law, illegally selling alcohol to their patrons, started, back in the 1800s, back in the late, 1880s, really. It's really with prohibition, they kind of, flourished because there was a reason for them to exist. But there's always a reason to, in any, society in that sense, people wanting cheap alcohol without paying tax and less rules and no one over your shoulder and calling time. So, there's that kind of thing. So they already existed, is what I guess the thing to say. But that idea of things being on the down low, the whole idea of speakeasy, speak freely, no one's listening, is an interesting concept. The one of the cool things to connect with the 20s, specifically with speakeasies, is the green door, the concept of the green door. Because often, you can't advertise an illegal drinking den, You can't put a sign up saying, come here for, hooch. So a lot of establishments just had a green door, no signage, but it became known that, behind the green door was usually a speakeasy. So that's an interesting little kind of snippet you can kind of throw into games in that way. Also, a lot of our misconceptions about the 20s are around alcohol, to be frank, American misconceptions in the fact that, the 18th Amendment, the Volstead Act, didn't actually make it illegal to drink alcohol, only to manufacture and sell it. So, for instance, because people knew it was coming, it was, they knew it was there. So there are many homes that stockpiled huge amounts of liquor before it actually happened. And there's various stories, but there's one, I think it's from New York, where that somebody managed to stock themselves up with a 14-year supply of alcohol. I mean, I don't know how much they were drinking a week, but 14 years of alcohol sounds quite a lot to me. So clearly, alcohol was pretty freely available. It wasn't, there wasn't this conception that it just wasn't available unless you went to the speakeasy, because people could still buy it for medicinal purposes. So it is around, and it is a lot more common than perhaps we sometimes think about historically. The other interesting facts about particularly in the US, one of the interesting snippets I kind of picked up on a while ago was in 1920 there was one of the, well, we would call it now a terrorist incident on Wall Street in New York, where a bomb went off, killing nearly 40 people and injuring many more. It was a big thing that is kind of forgotten to some degree in our memories. But what's interesting is the perpetrators were never identified, they were never caught, and nobody knows what the motive was. Was it it happened outside the offices of JP Morgan, so there's theories that it was a targeted attack on JP Morgan or the business, or was it a political thing about money and Wall Street in America? Was it a foreign power? Was it internal? Who knows? It was never solved in that way. But it's one of those kind of interesting aspects of history that these things happened in the past, not just in living memory.
There's a scenario in that for sure. I can't wait to see it. What about technology? I know that sometimes I've jumped into games and I hesitate a little bit when I describe cameras, or when I talk about exactly how fast or how flexible a car is. Can you give any insight on that? What are some common misconceptions?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of things like radio is the mass media of the period, but to give you a sense of the scale, I mean, it grew so rapidly in before the 1920s, around 1910, 1912, there was about 15-16% of the American population had electricity, but by the middle of the 20s, not even the end of the decade, over 60% of American homes had electricity. So, which is an interesting kind of thing to think about when you're setting your game, whether it's kind of 19, 20, 21, early 20s to the middle to the late 20s. And in the early 20s, it's quite possible that most of the homes you visit as an investigator do not have electricity. Certainly rurally, there wouldn't be electricity in the majority of cases. But by the time, if you're running a game 1926, then probably most reasonably well-to-do homes are going to have some form of electricity coming in, which then powers radios, which again see a massive uptake. About just over 70,000 homes, early 20s, have a radio receiver of some kind. By the end of the decade, 12 million households have it. It's just a staggering growth in terms of that. And obviously what that means is information. So in the early 20s, a very small percentage of people had this kind of mass communication other than newspapers. And so their information flow was much more limited in a sense. And so are they as well informed about what's going on when you go and visit them as later in the 20s, you know, they've got the radio on every night, news and everything else, much more informed in that way. So again, that might change how you present NPCs or particular kind of story threads potentially in that way. And cars, yeah, I mean, it's the same situation with cars. You know, cars, there weren't many at the beginning of the 20s. They were around. They were reasonably cheap, you know, about $300 for a Model T Ford or something like that, I think. And again, end of the 20s, there's cars everywhere, you know, and roads everywhere. The road building was huge. So again, getting around, whether you're playing in the early 20s or later 20s, can be quite different in a sense. But also, even in the late 20s, you know, cars ain't as fast as they are today. You know, they are much slower and they are more prone to breaking down. I mean, we all have our stories about our own cars breaking down, but tires going flat, all that kind of stuff, very, very, very regular. So a journey between Arkham and Kingsport on the coast, you know, just a handful of miles, will take longer than it would today. I know, you know, we can get up Google Map and go, oh, it's only like 4 miles. Surely you can do it in half an hour. You know, actually might take longer because they probably had a puncture because the roads aren't that good. Probably had a puncture. Maybe the ignition has a problem. Maybe you run out of petrol. You know, things do take longer, and so that kind of pace of life thing is slower to some degree.
You've kind of talked about this a little bit, but as you pointed out, the 1920s have a lot of range within them, and things get really different depending on what part of the decade you're in. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about tonally in a game of Call of Cthulhu, what's different if you're playing in the early 20s versus the late 20s?
Sure. And this, you know, a lot of it is often, you know, coming out of America, but a lot of, particularly tonally, it's kind of worldwide, because one of the defining features, and I mentioned at the start about these kind of bookended by these periods of darkness, really. In the early 20s, you know, the world, you know, more or less, is coming out not only of the Great War, of which, you know, an unprecedented amount of, you know, people died, and that obviously has a knock-on effect to, you know, your home, you know, because family members are now gone, and everyone knows someone they lost in the war, and if they didn't lose someone, they've got the survivors of the war with their many varied traumas, injuries that are, you know, in your face, reminding you of the, you know, the dark times. Now, not only that, at the beginning of the 20s, you've got a pandemic, you know, the flu, which, yeah, again, went across the world and had devastating effects on, you know, killing off, you know, many people. And so you know, you've got this kind of double whammy just before the 1920s start of this kind of period of darkness, as I call it. Now, as you go forward into the 20s, obviously the world is still recovering from spending all its money on war and all the, you know, consequences of war and the pandemic, and so the economies are poor. You know, that they have not yet reached. However, politically, things happen in the US particularly, and are mirrored somewhat across the world, where actually money starts to flow again, and we get to this kind of midpoint of the 20s into up to 1929, where prosperity becomes king, where actually the person on the street actually has money in their pocket now. There's no, you know, there's no kind of rationing in a sense from, you know, from the earlier times, and people become much more affluent. The whole kind of idea of investing in the stock market really booms, particularly in America, and people have money. And so this sees this upswing in prosperity, not only in the US, but in Weimar, Germany. As you know, if you go and read the Berlin book, you have these periods of economic downturn not suddenly, but change during the 1920s, and things become more vibrant. Color, the darkness recedes and color comes to its full glow, and society in general kind of goes, enough of that, we need to party now, in a sense, you know. And so you get this rise of this kind of hedonism kind of, you know, aspect of the 20s. And so that's a very different kind of milieu in terms of what you're seeing, how people's lives are, if you're playing a game in the early 20s as opposed to the later 20s. It's, quite pronounced, and obviously a lot of the things we get are what we recall of the 1920s historically, the flappers, cars everywhere, radios everywhere, things I've just mentioned, are all the consequences of this, and particularly socially we see this in the role of women, that kind of sense of emancipation, sense of freedom, which obviously the flapper kind of is the signifier for, but obviously goes beyond that. Even in the UK, the women's right to vote was changed, that now any women 21 or above could now vote in the 20s, whereas before they couldn't. So there's this, it's not just confined to to the US in a sense.
So on that note, looking a little more globally, what other interesting things are happening in the 1920s that you can explore in a game of Call of Cthulhu, which might not come up if you're playing in the traditional kind of New England setting?
One of the things, one key one for Call of Cthulhu keepers is Egyptomania. In 1922, Howard Carter and Carnarvon discover Tutankhamun's tomb with untold riches and fabulous kind of items, and they, and the world reacts with kind of wow, a collective wow, and this kind of revival effectively in Egyptian history and so on, and that kind of bursts out across the world. Carter goes on tour, and these things get shown in newspapers and toured around and whatnot. And so there's this real bursting of kind of interest in ancient culture, particularly Egypt, but obviously that can go beyond there. That can inspire people, everyday people, to get interested in this kind of thing, dig out, old mustering tomes of lore, and or desirous of, I want a piece of this golden artifact, and well, I can't get one from Carter's dig. I can get, there's a guy in that strange shop who tells me this is from Egypt, this box, strange angled box, etc., etc. And so it's good inspiration. Other things, 1927, I mean, there's at least 2 books written specifically on the year 1927. There's a Bill Bryson book. There's another book. Just put 1927 book into Amazon or wherever you go, and literally 1927 is, if there's one year in the 20s where things happen that have these kind of massive kind of implications worldwide, 1927 is it. It's when the financial downturn actually begins until it's realized in 1929. It's when Charles Lindbergh, flies solo across the Atlantic, and it's only in the following year that Amelia Earhart, flies the same route and that kind of thing. And these are world-changing events. Lindbergh is the first global celebrity. He literally can go anywhere and people know who he is, and thousands, millions are, have Lindy Mania, and he goes on a world tour and so on and so on. And so the idea of flying becomes romanced and becomes a thing that people can begin to dream about, just like, the moon landing in 69, before then, you could dream about going to the moon, but it wasn't a reality. But now people have done it. It's like, well, because I could go to the moon in my lifetime? Could it, those kind of ideas start to flourish, and so have this implication of people looking to get in on it in whatever way they can, even if it's just to see Charles Lindbergh and wave and get a piece of him in a sense. But it can inspires people to get into trying to create aircraft, trying to become pilots, trying to become explorers, trying to break world records, and so on. Trying to be the first to do something. It inspires all these many kind of things, which can all feed back into, your games, your scenario plots, in many ways.
So to close things off then, do you have a couple of pieces or a single line of coalesced advice for people to really bring the 1920s to life in their games of Call of Cthulhu?
I think my biggest advice is what I said already about don't get too hung up on it. I mean, any historical periods you play in, whether it's the 20s, Dark Ages, or whatever, don't get hung up on it. There's no point. The only trick is to be consistent. So if you let's say decide that you describe an NPC using a ballpoint pen, and then you suddenly think after the game, I'll just check that actually they were invented then, and you find out you're a year out before he was using his pen before they were invented. It doesn't matter. Just carry on. Ballpoint pens were invented in your game, and to be frank, unless one of your players is some sort of pen nut, it really doesn't matter. But you just apply the same logic across the board. And if you get it wrong and it does have an impact, then just say to go, hey guys, I got it wrong. Cars weren't invented in 1642. We're just going to say that was a cart with a horse. Okay, just ignore me. We'll move on. That's fine too. So that's really the biggest kind of advice I have. But the main thing is just to kind of, I think, if you want to bring the period to life, the 1920s to life, I think thinking about when in the 20s you're setting the game, and thinking about how that relates to society at large, just helps you to build more color into it. So like I've discussed, in the early 20s, things are a little bit more depressed. Things are a little grayer. Things haven't yet recovered from the Great War and the pandemic and so on, and people are wanting to get out of this misery, but it's a daily struggle. Further on in the decade, people have got out of that. They are happier. They are more exuberant. They've got more money to spend. They're more willing to be adventurous. They're getting inspired by Lindenberg, et cetera, et cetera. So you get a change, almost like a change in personality, not only in the people, but in the sights you're seeing around you. The whole, Harlem at the beginning of the 20s is a different place to Harlem later on when the Renaissance is happening, and there's a reason why everyone's going to Harlem in the Renaissance, because it's great. Things are happening. It's a fabulous place. Just think about those kind of contexts for your game to help you just breathe some more kind of life into your descriptions. And, you take a back step, like I've tried to suggest in terms of thinking about, specific kind of things going on in the 20s. They can be inspiration for plots or motivations, even if they're not the key plot of your game. They can be motivations for NPCs of why they are getting involved or want to help or don't want to help, or et cetera, et cetera.